Welcome to the session on preparing and presenting a lecture. We will begin the session with a simple set of questions based on the pre-session readings and your own personal experiences teaching and or being a student. What are traditional lectures good for? What are the disadvantages of a traditional lecture format? Take a moment to think about the questions on your own. If possible, discuss your answers with another participant. Then, post your answers to the online course forum. Pause the video here while you complete this activity. Welcome back. Let's discuss some of the answers to the pros and cons of lectures that you might have come up with during the brainstorming activity. So what's so great about lectures? Lectures can be great for providing students with the most up-to-date information, approaches, etc., within a particular subject or field. This is particularly important for subjects that change quickly, such as biology. Lectures can also be very good instructional models for summarizing large amounts of related information. Lectures can be adapted to different audiences. When provided by a good communicator, lectures can be inspiring in a way that other mediums for content delivery are not. What are the cons of traditional lectures? Well, although the lectures are a good medium for transmitting information, lectures are not effective at helping students develop critical thinking skills or developing independent thought. Also, lectures are long, typically at least 50 minutes, and are difficult to keep students' attention. This does not mean that we should completely discard the lecture as a mode of instruction. As we have discussed, lectures can be effective under certain circumstances. During the session, we will begin by exploring what structure and delivery of a lecture work best to maximize student attention and understanding. During the next session, we will concentrate on effective techniques that you can integrate into your lecture to promote student understanding. The goal of this session is to illustrate how you can structure and deliver your lecture to help support student learning. The learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end of the session, you should be able to explain how the structure of a lecture can influence learning, explain effective means of communicating content during a lecture, and critique and evaluate lectures. This session will be organized into two parts. During the first part, we will discuss things to keep in mind when preparing a lecture. These things have the potential to increase the effectiveness of your lecture and include the goals of the lecture, the structure of the lecture and how it can help support learning, and lecture formats that you can use to introduce variability in your instruction, which, as we have discussed previously, it's important for increasing knowledge retention. The second part of the session will be focused on best practices for content delivery, mainly what we can learn from actors about voice modulation, nonverbal communication, among others, and how we can create effective visuals using the Blackboard or PowerPoint slides. We've talked about the pros and cons of lectures. Now take a moment to think about the attributes of an effective lecturer. What makes an effective lecturer? Pause the video here and write down your answers. Rosenshine and Furst review more than 50 carefully selected studies and publish their work in Research on Teaching Performance Criteria. In it, they propose 11 teacher behaviors that influence learning. For the sake of simplicity, we'll only list here the top 5 teacher behavior variables in order of importance. These variables proposed by Rosenshine and Furst were 1. Clarity, 2. Variability, 3. Enthusiasm, 4. Task-oriented instruction, and 5. Student opportunities to ask questions. Do any of these 5 teacher behavior variables appear in your own list? During the session, we will concentrate on the first 3 of the teacher behaviors and how they can affect student learning. During our session on interactive teaching and active learning, we will explore teacher behavior variables 4 and 5 in more detail. First, let's start by discussing the importance of identifying course goals and objectives when preparing your lecture. So, when preparing and organizing a lecture, where do we start? You can use the backward design process to develop effective lectures, just like we did when we designed a course. As we mentioned in the session on creating a course and a syllabus, backward design is used to effectively design courses that minimize rote memorization and maximize knowledge transfer. This can be applied to lectures as well. Backward design is used to effectively design lectures that minimize rote memorization and maximize knowledge transfer. Begin by determining your goal and learning objectives for that particular lecture. Then, think of the assignments that will help you evaluate whether your students have achieved your learning goals, and end by designing the in-class activities and instruction that will help support the learning objectives. Let's take a closer look at what you should keep in mind when beginning to think about goals for your lectures. When we start to think about the goals for the particular lecture you are planning, we begin with a small number of concepts we would like our students to be able to know and do. We often recommend that you try to cover only a few concepts, less than 5, in a given lecture. The reason for keeping the number of concepts you cover to a minimum is because humans' working memory is limited. What is working memory? Working memory is a brain system that allows you to temporarily store and manipulate information. It turns out that humans are not great at retaining lots of different objects, concepts, or abstractions in working memory. In a classic paper, the Harvard University psychologist George Miller summarized various experiments testing the limitations on working memory. This figure represents one of these experiments, which tested the ability to recall closely related sound pitches. As you can see, when the number of different sound pitches is small, 1 or 2, which in this figure is called input information, human subjects' ability to distinguish between the sound pitches, which in this figure is indicated as transmitted information, it's accurate. However, as the number of different sound pitches increases to more than 3, the ability to distinguish between different sound pitches plateaus. In this same paper, George Miller summarized other experiments that tested the limits of working memory in distinguishing between different colors, tastes, points on a square, etc. He argued that the number of objects or abstractions the average human can hold in working memory is 7 plus or minus 2. This has great implications for how we teach and how material is presented. We should remember that our students have the same working memory limitations as everybody else. In addition, our students are usually novices in whichever field we teach. Therefore, they haven't had time to incorporate the knowledge into their own existing frameworks. Once you have chosen the concepts you will include during your lecture, it is important to make sure that your students are also well aware of your goals. This includes communicating your goals, the learning objectives of the lecture, and the concepts and topics to be covered. As you can see, during this course, we always begin with our goals, learning objectives, and an outline of the session. The goals and learning objectives let students know what we expect of them, what they are supposed to know and be able to do by the end of the lecture. The structure of your lecture can help tremendously in communicating your goals clearly and allowing you to retain your students' attention. As you recall, clarity was the top teacher behavior variable associated with student learning in Rosenshine and Firth's meta-analysis. The structure of a lecture can help facilitate clarity. Let's explore in more detail how the structure of a lecture can impact student learning. In this figure, the relative amount of student attention is plotted over the duration of a traditional 50 minutes lecture. As you can see, students' attention is highest during the first 10 minutes of a traditional lecture, and then decreases drastically with a small increase during the last 10 minutes of the class. Notice that students' attention can be quite low in the middle of the lecture. How can we retain students' attention throughout the whole class period? One simple strategy involves structuring the lecture differently. In this strategy, we begin with introducing the topic of the lecture with a thought-provoking question or activity to spark students' interest. Rather than lecturing throughout the whole length of the lecture, we lecture in 10 to 15-minute blocks, followed by a small group activity related to that section. The lecture then ends with a concluding section. Breaking up the lecture in this way allows for students to reset their attention so that each time a new section begins, we have their full attention. For increased clarity, let's break down the components of this strategy further. Rather than beginning a lecture with the goals and learning objectives for that particular lecture, we open with an example or activity that demonstrates the importance or relevance for the set of concepts to be uncovered during that lecture. We call this type of opening an attention getter. An attention getter is a powerful way to engage students. It also serves to demonstrate to the students why the set of concepts and topics to be covered are important and oftentimes are used to demonstrate how the concepts relate to real life. Here's an example of an attention getter. In this lecture, the students explore the structure or shape of a protein that repairs damaged DNA. The goal of the lecture is to relate the structure of a protein to its function. Rather than starting with the basic of DNA repair or the basics of protein structure, the lecture begins with the following number: 10,000. 10,000 is the number of unintended changes or mutations that occur to a single human cell's DNA each day. The human body has, on average, approximately 10 to 50 trillion cells. This means that the body must repair an extraordinary number of mutations daily, which is quite a formidable task. How does the body do that? By starting with a number of unintended changes in the DNA sequence, students become very interested and invested in the lecture. It makes the lecture really relevant to their actual lives. Attention getters can be a simple set of surprising facts, a small activity, or a demonstration and/or a question to answer. For example, at the beginning of this session, we began with a brainstorming activity that asked you to list the pros and cons of lectures. Another type of attention getter consists of starting with an experiment and a question. The rest of the lecture will then explore the concepts that are demonstrated in the experiment. The end of the lecture concludes with the performance of the experiment and answering of the questions posed at the beginning of the lecture. After sparking students' interest, then it makes sense to explain your goals and learning objectives for that lecture. Outlines are also very important since they allow students to know where you are and where you're going. Unlike an expert, a student does not have a good sense of what's important versus what it's not. An outline helps students organize their notes and makes the organization of the lecture transparent. After you have gone through the goal and learning objectives for your lecture, it is important to make connections between the current and prior lecture, as well as to expose background information that the students will need to understand the main concepts being discussed during the lecture. For example, my connecting slide for this session is the slide that illustrates the backward design process originally shown in the session on designing a course and constructing a syllabus. This slide serves as a reminder of content covered during a prior lecture and connects information from a prior lecture to information in this lecture. As we previously mentioned in the session on Principles of Learning, connecting concepts from different lectures in a course serves to facilitate meaning-making and help students decipher how different concepts of the course are related. The body or main section of the lecture should be used to elaborate on the concepts that will be uncovered during the lecture. As we previously mentioned, the body of the lecture should be subdivided into smaller blocks, each 10 to 15 minutes long, followed by a small group activity. Each block should only cover a single concept or key point, making sure to provide various and diverse examples to demonstrate the application of the concept. As we will see in the session titled Interactive Teaching and Active Learning, students learn best when they're actively engaged with the material and are asked to do something with it, particularly when they engage with other students as well. The small group activities that follow each session during the lecture facilitate interaction between the students and has the potential to increase the learning gains in your course. In addition, they provide opportunities for students to ask questions. The end of each block should provide a brief summary of what has been covered during that block and a transition into the next block. A lecture should conclude with a summary of the main points to reinforce key concepts. We recommend that you use different words from those used to introduce the lecture. If possible, end the session with a question or a set of statements that asks students to apply the material uncovered during that lecture. Here's an example of a question used to conclude a lecture. In this example, the lecture topic is DNA, and the three main points covered are the double helix or structure of DNA, the human genome, and the Book of Life project. The lecture concludes with a summary of the points covered. Additionally, the lecture ends with the following question. If you could genetically alter a vegetable or a piece of fruit, what would you change and why? You can then ask your students to think about the question posed at the end of the lecture and come to the next class prepared to share their answers. You can devote a few minutes at the beginning of the next lecture discussing the answer to the concluding question. By posing a question at the end of the lecture, we encourage our students to think about the main points and concepts covered even after the end of lecture. Now that we have explored how changing the structure of a lecture can increase student attention and facilitate group work, we will talk about the types of lecture formats to consider when organizing the body of your lectures. Rosenshine's and First's meta-analysis identify variability in instructional methods as the second most influential teacher behavior variable in student learning. In fact, from the session titled Principles of Learning, we learned that varying the conditions under which learning takes place facilitates meaning-making. Coding information through the use of different modes of organizational schemes leads to a richer set of connections between concepts and facilitates the construction or adaptation of existing mental frameworks. Here are different formats that you can consider when organizing the body of your lecture. These represent only a sample. Different formats might be better suited for different disciplines or instructional approaches. The expository lecture demonstrates a single question or problem and is often organized in a hierarchical form. This type of format is great when trying to summarize broad concepts or key ideas. In the thesis format, a problem or concept is usually presented as a sequential series of arguments and propositions that are supported through data or experimental results. In this type of lecture, the most common approach is to present some initial data, followed by a hypothesis that can explain the data provided, and additional data that either supports or alters the proposed hypothesis. This format is particularly appropriate when exploring experimental approaches. When using the problem-solving format, the lecture begins with a difficult problem or an interesting question. The answer to the question unfolds throughout the lecture, preferably with student participation. This type of lecture format is very applicable to many of science and engineering courses. In the case study format, the lecture begins with a real-life case scenario that the students then follow step by step, drawing general principles from it. This type of format has been extensively used in business, law, and medical school education. Now that we've talked about some of the principles and considerations of preparing a lecture, let's apply some of them throughout the completion of a small group activity. For a concept you would like to teach, first, determine the goal and learning objectives for the concept. Second, think about the material and main points to cover that would support the teaching and learning of that concept. Third, choose a lecture format among the ones we have discussed, or any others that you might know that will be appropriate for this lecture and justify your decision. Work individually for 15 minutes and then share your ideas with a colleague if appropriate. Also, post your individual answers in the online discussion forum. Welcome back. You have now planned and prepared your lecture, and now you actually have to deliver. Effective instructors are also effective communicators. Although organization and preparation are extremely important for delivering an effective lecture, being a good instructor also requires thinking and considering how the information is delivered. Communication is much more than the delivery of information. Communication involves pacing, intonation, body movements, and gestures. Using visuals to support and illustrate key teaching points is also an important component for effective communication and delivery. In this part of the session, we will think about what makes for effective communication, including verbal and nonverbal communication and visual aids. First, we can look at what actors can teach us about effective communication. Acting and teaching have some common features. They both involve persuasive communication. When we present in front of a classroom, we're in many ways performing in front of our students. As we have already mentioned, the third most important teacher behavior variable identified by Rosenshine and First was enthusiasm. How many of us have attended a lecture on an interesting subject where the speaker's monotone voice has made the subject completely uninteresting? Engaging students involves communicating and transmitting your enthusiasm for the subject matter, which can be accomplished through verbal and nonverbal communication. What can actors teach us about effective communication? Actors use intonation, emphasize words, and draw attention. Actors emphasize certain words. When we speak, we tend to emphasize the nouns and the verbs of a sentence. When you deliver a lecture, practice emphasizing the nouns and verbs. Actors also use pacing to communicate effectively. Actors modulate their pacing to emphasize certain keywords and draw attention. Speech that is either too fast or too slow will result in the loss of students' attention and decreased clarity. Actors use modulation and pace to persuade and inspire. Neither of these two recommendations might come naturally to you at first, but with time and practice, they will become integral components of your lecture. Actors also have the ability to connect and engage with their audience. Actors do this through verbal and nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication involves posture, eye contact, body language, and gestures. Nonverbal communication is the single most powerful form of communication. When we communicate, we're doing it mostly through nonverbal communication, as only 25% of the information received by our audience is verbal. Therefore, if the verbal and the nonverbal information being communicated to your students do not agree, your students will remember mostly what was communicated through the nonverbal forms, such as body language and gestures. When connecting with your student audience, keep in mind the following points. Make eye contact with your audience. To make sure you do not focus on only one section within your classroom, we advise that you trace a W with your eyes without resting your eyesight on any particular person for too long. Use movement and gesturing to engage your students more directly. When standing in front of your classroom, do not stand in a single place without moving. Instead, use movement to transition between ideas and to engage and connect with your students. For example, when eliciting answers from a particular student or a group of students, come closer to the same location within the classroom where the student or student group is, to better engage with eye contact and presence. Use gesturing to emphasize or to draw attention to key points, or to communicate a concept effectively. Reduce noise. It is important to remember that nonverbal communication is central to the effective delivery of your message. But used inappropriately, it can also detract from your message. For example, constant movement around the classroom or flailing your hands can be distracting, giving students an excuse to not pay attention to you. Lastly, let's talk about how you can manage anxiety. Public speaking is anxiety-provoking for most people. We all get nervous whenever we have to speak in front of an audience, even when we have done it many times. Let's try some exercises that you can do to reduce anxiety. These exercises can help by warming up your diaphragm and vocal cords, by helping focus your attention, and by relaxing you. Please stand up from your seats. We're going to try these together. Let's start with an exercise that helps you warm up your vocal cords. We will start by sustaining your breath on a hum. Then, play with the pitch up and down the scale. Feel the vibrations resonate through your body. Are you ready? Okay, repeat after me. Second, let's do a breathing exercise, which can be effective for reducing and managing anxiety. Close your eyes and focus on your breath. I will indicate when to breathe in and out. Ready? Okay, let's do it together. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Well, that was fun. Now, let's return to other aspects of delivering your lecture. Part of your delivery will involve either writing on the blackboard or using PowerPoint slides. When considering either the blackboard or PowerPoint slides, it is important to keep a few principles in mind. When we use the blackboard, we tend to write key points and draw figures and diagrams. Because most instructors do not plan what they will write on the blackboard, most of the content organization happens during the actual delivery, leading to mistakes and making the lecture difficult to follow. Therefore, when using the blackboard, you should keep in mind the accuracy and visual organization of content. PowerPoint has become a popular tool for instruction. Instructors use PowerPoint because it allows them to convey both written and visual information easily. However, these same aspects can make PowerPoint slides into an ineffective communication tool for teaching. The tendency is to put everything you need to say and refer to during your lecture in your PowerPoint slides. Therefore, when using PowerPoint slides, you should keep things simple. Remember, less is more. When using the blackboard, make sure to write clearly. Studies have shown that students write approximately 90% of the material written on the board versus approximately 60% of what is said. Therefore, make sure your handwriting is legible. Pause regularly during your lecture to write down key items as you speak. This gives the students time to write down important information as well as time to process what is being said. Remember that students probably do not know the information being presented, and they're likely to be seeing it for the first time. Providing time to write and think about the information being presented is key. When drawing figures, make sure you label everything clearly, including the X and Y axis in figures and corresponding units of measurement. When you write a formula for the first time, make sure to define and label all of the variables within the formula. This also applies for important terms. Write them down and define their meaning so that students can refer back to them throughout and after the lecture. When using the blackboard, make sure to space your content throughout. Organize your content so that related materials appear in the same location within the blackboard. Use lines to divide sections within your lecture. If you have access to more than one board, you might want to use one of these boards for information you would like your students to refer to throughout the lecture, such as the goals, the learning objectives, the outline, the key terms, formulas, and concepts defined. Effective Blackboard technique requires planning. Consider using a note card or a small piece of paper to represent a single blackboard. Plan and write everything you would write beforehand, utilizing a new note card or piece of paper each time you need to erase and use a clean blackboard. When using PowerPoint, the temptation is to write as much as possible on the slide. Here's an example that illustrates this point. What is wrong with this PowerPoint slide? There's too much text. It is difficult for students to follow what you're saying if they're actually trying to read the long sentences in your slides at the same time. This results in cognitive overload, confusion, and loss of students' attention. Remember, we're not good at holding more than 7 items or abstractions in working memory. Therefore, keeping text to a minimum and simplifying diagrams is key. Instead of using full sentences, use a few words to highlight each of the key points. When possible, use images rather than text. To illustrate a point you're articulating verbally with an image is more effective than just having text on a slide. Here's an example of what we mean. On the left is a diagram illustrating the different cognitive levels of Bloom's taxonomy. On the right is a different way to represent the same content with lots of text. The image on the left is much easier for a student to understand and does not lead to cognitive overload. We recommend that you try to use the Blackboard as much as possible for text and figures, and use images in PowerPoint mostly for things that are hard to draw or illustrate. This slide illustrates how using both lots of text and images on a slide creates lots of noise and detracts from your message. This slide also illustrates the importance of using high-quality images in your PowerPoint presentation. Using low-resolution images that you cannot properly see is ineffective. Using high-resolution quality images that you can see clearly is more effective than using low-resolution images. Instead, try to use the highest possible resolution of the image you want to use and scale the image in PowerPoint. If you're not able to find a high enough resolution image, consider a different image, or if possible, draw it yourself on the Blackboard or in PowerPoint. Last, consider the colors, number of colors, fonts, and the use of animation carefully. Try to minimize noise so that your presentation does not detract from the material you are conveying. When considering colors, optimize contrast. For example, a dark font on a dark background leads to a text that is not readable. Consider there are a lot of people, especially men, cannot tell the difference between green and red. And keep in mind that bright colors like yellow are good for dark backgrounds, but are hard to read in light backgrounds. Make sure to use animation sparingly and only to illustrate processes relevant to your key points. Unnecessary visuals can detract from your message. The same goes for the number of different fonts. Use 1 or 2 different fonts. Keep it simple, and don't give your students a reason to not hear what you're saying. Now that we've had time to discuss how to deliver effective lectures, let's consider the lecture that you were asked to watch prior to viewing the session. Think about what made Professor Lewin's lectures effective and what you think he could have done better. First, work on your own for 5 minutes and then discuss your answers to these 2 questions with your partner for another 5 minutes. Provide your individual answers to these 2 questions on the course's online forum. Pause the video here. In this section, we've discussed how to prepare an effective lecture. This involves using backward design for defining our goals and learning objectives, considering ways to grab students' attention and retaining it through the use of attention getters and through the division of the lecture into small sections that are separated by small group activities, and various formats to consider when structuring the content. We also discussed and demonstrated effective modes of communication. In particular, we highlighted intonation, movement, and pacing as ways to engage and emphasize key content. We also practiced some exercises used by professional actors to reduce anxiety and increase performance. Lastly, we cover how to use Blackboard and PowerPoint slides during teaching to emphasize clarity, accuracy, and simplicity as the key elements in these instructional modes. I would like to end this session by asking you to reflect on the following question. How can you incorporate what we have learned today to improve aspects of lecture preparation and delivering in your own teaching? Do you have any questions or comments? Take a moment to write any lingering questions or comments that you may have on the online discussion forum now. The post-session assignment for this session is to write up and share your individual evaluation of Professor Lewin's lectures through the online discussion forum. Please see the instructions on the course website for more information on this assignment. Immediately following your viewing of this session, please complete the online survey for the mud card.